This aircraft was one of the best float planes in World War II, but as many pre-war designs, it quickly became obsolete during the conflict. It was still used in many roles during the war, and it served in several other countries, outside Germany as well. This was the Heinkel He G115, so let's see the history of this aircraft today. In the 1930s, the German Luftwaffe needed float planes to supplement the Navy, as the only bigger two-engine aircraft in service was the Heinkel He G59. The development of this aircraft started way back in 1931, and even by the time it entered service, it was clearly outdated, as monoplanes started to take over the roles of the biplane designs. The He G59, though it was still used for various roles during World War II, was clearly outdated, and only saw combat in the first months of the war. After that, they were only used as training, transport, or sea rescue planes. Though this type only entered service in 1935, the same year the RLM already posted new requirements for its successor. The new aircraft had to be a faster twin-engine monoplane design, which can be used in multiple roles, like reconnaissance, maritime patrol, or anti-shipping operations. Heinkel already had a lot of experience with float planes and flying boats, and supplied many types to the military and the civilian market. They entered their He G115 design, and the main opponent for the Heinkel aircraft in this tender was the Blohm & Voss He G140. The preliminary comparison showed that the two designs had very similar characteristics, so prototypes were ordered from both manufacturers. The He G115 made its maiden flight in August 1937. But according to the first experiences, the new aircraft had terrible flight characteristics, and it was actually terrifying to fly. This prompted a series of improvements on the design, especially after Ernst Udet, the head of development at the Luftwaffe, told Heinkel the aircraft will never be accepted in such a state. The design team made several modifications, and power-assisted control surfaces were used to make the controls less heavy, resulting in a completely different report a few weeks later, now praising the new design as easy to fly. Its rival, the He G140, was finished a bit later than the Heinkel design, and made its maiden flight in September the same year. But the first prototype was soon lost in an accident, so the V2 variant participated in the comparison trials. During the trials, the He G115 was declared superior, as it had much lower takeoff and landing speeds, and actually its rival was again damaged on landing, breaking one of the floats and one of its engines. Still, after the winner was declared, the work on it continued for a while as a backup for the He G115, but finally in September 1939 the program was terminated. In March 1938, the V1 prototype of the He G115 performed a record-breaking 7-hour 15 minutes long-distance flight, loaded with 2,000 kg weight and setting 8 world speed records. The prototype was modified for this attempt, with a new nose design, a more streamlined cockpit, and various aerodynamic improvements on the fuselage. Another record-breaking attempt a year later, to fly the aircraft to South America, covering 10,000 kilometers, failed. As about 2/3 of the way, the portside engine developed an oil leak, and the crew had no other choice than to land the aircraft near a German steamer, the Monte Pascual. They were taken aboard along with the plane and arrived to South America aboard the ship. Speaking of modifications, the first prototypes, the V1 and V2, originally featured the first variant of the nose design, which wasn't very aerodynamic or elegant, and was built like that to allow the gunner to operate the gun in a half-upright position. The following V3 featured a new glazed nose, a much sleeker design, where the nose gunner could operate the gun in a prone position. The V4 variant featured a new rudder, and this was the last version with wire-supported floats. After this version, all planes featured rigid bracing on the floats. This variant became the base for the first A0 and A1 production variants. The later V5 variant became the base for the B-series aircraft. And with that we arrived to the variants of the He G115. As we mentioned, the first A-series was based on the V4 version. The pre-production A0 variant only featured one machine gun in the dorsal position, and the next A1 version introduced the second nose-mounted machine gun. The A2 was an export variant identical to the A1, but supplied without weaponry to Norway and Sweden. The following A3 version featured new communications equipment and revised weapons bay. The B1 series was based on the V5 prototype, featuring increased fuel capacity and range of weapons. The stronger airframe allowed the maximum takeoff weight to be raised above 10,000 kilograms. The B1R1 version was a reconnaissance variant carrying cameras. The B1R2 was a bomber variant with the capability to carry 500 kilograms of bombs. And the R3 was the mine layer version, with the ability to carry 2 500 kilogram or 1 1000 kilogram mines. The following B2 line was identical to the B1 but featured reinforced floats with ice runners. The next C variant introduced heavier armament, featuring 15 or 20 mm cannons in the nose, and optionally it could also carry rear-firing machine guns in the engine nacelles. The Plan D variant was skipped because it was designed to use the BMW 801 radial engines, but those were needed for the FW190 fighters. The last E model entered production in 1943, despite the He 115 production officially stopped in early 1940, but apparently the wartime needs required the production to restart in 1943. The He 115 was not a small aircraft. With a length of 17.3 meters and a wingspan of 22.2 meters, it was comparable to most medium bombers. The aircraft had an empty weight of 5,290 kilograms, and the maximum takeoff weight was 10,400 kilograms. It used two BMW 132K air-cooled radial engines, producing 960 horsepower each. With these power plants, the plane could reach a maximum speed of 327 km an hour. It had a combat range of 2,100 km and a service ceiling of 5,200 meters. The armament of the aircraft consisted of 3 7.92mm machine guns, and some of the C variants had fixed 15 or 20mm cannons in the nose. The plane could carry either 5 250 kg bombs, or 2 bombs and 1 torpedo, or optionally a 1000 kg sea mine. The first time for the He 115 in a war environment was during the Spanish Civil War, when two of them flew to Mallorca in early 1939 for a so-called Mediterranean corrosion test. They flew several reconnaissance missions with Spanish markings without enemy contact during their short stay, before returning to Germany in May. They saw constant use in the early part of World War II, mainly on the Baltic and North Seas. Their most frequent use was laying mines, but during this period they were used actively as torpedo bombers against Allied ships and convoys as well, as the lack of air defenses on the ships allowed them to operate with relative safety. This, however, didn't last long, as with the introduction of escort carriers and increasing armament on the convoys, their losses started to mount. During the invasion of Norway, both sides operated the type, as the Norwegians ordered a few of these planes before the war broke out. When the country capitulated, 4 of these Norwegian planes escaped to England. The exiled Norwegian government initially wanted to use these planes to drop leaflets over the bigger cities in their country, but luckily the British intervened and shut this operation down, as it clearly would have been suicide. Later these planes were used by the RAF for covert operations, flown by the original Norwegian crews. Another Norwegian plane flew to Finland. It was interned by the Finns and used against the Soviets. Sweden also operated the type, as they ordered 12 of them before the outbreak of the war. They were actually kept in service until 1952. As the war progressed, more advanced designs overshadowed the He 115 in most of its intended roles, especially in the anti-shipping raids, where the big slow plane became increasingly vulnerable. They were still used in the mine-laying role, but during the Battle of Britain suffered heavy losses, mainly from the British coastal air defense. As we mentioned, the production of these planes actually ceased in 1940, but it was restarted in 1943 with the E model. Though clearly outdated by this time, they stayed in service until the end of the war, but instead of combat roles, they were used for transport, reconnaissance, and mostly for covert operations to deliver agents to their targets. Though the He 115 became obsolete early in World War II, it is still regarded as one of the most successful float planes of the war, and though it's not as glamorous as some other aircraft of the era, it is very much worth remembering. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.